August 13, 1945. 25,000 feet above the Korean peninsula. The war was nearly over, Japan's Air Force a shadow of its former might. Most American pilots expected token resistance, if any. A routine escort mission for Second Lieutenant Oscar Perdomo and his P-47 Thunderbolt, Lil Meaty's meat chopper. Then the radio crackled. "Bandits! 11 o'clock low! Jesus Christ, there's 50 of them!" 50 Japanese fighters, Nakajima Franks, their engines screaming at 400 miles per hour, climbing toward a single American squadron. The mathematics were brutal. The odds, impossible. Everything doctrine taught said this was suicide. Everything logic demanded said retreat. But Perdomo's gun camera film would capture something no training manual ever described, something that would make him the last ace of World War II, in the span of minutes that defied every assumption about aerial combat. One American pilot, 50 enemy fighters. What happened next would prove that sometimes the impossible is just another word for legendary. The dark specks against the western horizon multiplied with terrifying speed. What had appeared as a handful of contacts moments earlier now resolved into a massive formation of Japanese fighters climbing aggressively toward the American bombers. Perdomo's radio exploded with urgent transmissions as every pilot in the squadron simultaneously spotted the approaching threat. "Jesus Christ, there's at least 50 of them." Lieutenant Colonel Garrison's voice cut through the chaos with practiced authority. "All Thunderbolt flights, this is Hammer Lead. We've got multiple bandits, Angels 15 and climbing. Maintain formation and prepare to engage." Perdomo's tactical mind processed the situation with crystalline clarity. The approaching aircraft were primarily Nakajima Ki-84 Hayats, Franks in Allied terminology, among Japan's most capable fighters. Each Frank packed two 20mm cannon and two 7.7mm machine guns, with a top speed of 400 miles per hour and climb performance that could challenge even the P-47N at altitude. More importantly, their pilots had managed to coordinate a formation attack of unprecedented scale for this late stage of the war. This was no desperate last stand by fuel-starved stragglers. This was a carefully planned assault by what remained of Japan's elite fighter units. The numbers were starkly brutal. 12 American P-47Ns against more than 50 Japanese fighters, odds of better than 4-1 in the enemy's favor. Standard fighter doctrine called for maintaining formation integrity and using superior firepower to break up enemy attacks, but the overwhelming numerical disadvantage rendered traditional tactics questionable at best. Perdomo checked his fuel gauges and ammunition counters one final time. Full tanks and a complete load of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would test every aspect of his training and the P-47N's legendary durability. The first Japanese fighters reached effective firing range at 22,000 feet, their climb performance impressive despite the thin air at altitude. Perdomo could see the distinctive radial engine cowlings and squared-off wingtips that marked them as Franks, along with the rising sun insignias painted on their wings. The lead elements opened fire at maximum range, streams of 20mm cannon shells and machine gun bullets creating deadly patterns in the sky around the American formation. The Japanese pilots were good, their gunnery accurate, and their formation discipline tight, despite the complexity of coordinating such a large attack. Lieutenant Garrison rolled his P-47 into a diving attack on the lead Japanese formation, his .850 caliber machine guns blazing. The combined firepower of a Thunderbolt's armament was devastating, 4,000 rounds per minute of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition capable of destroying any fighter aircraft with a solid burst. Garrison's target, a Frank painted in dark green camouflage, absorbed multiple hits before exploding in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. The victory was short-lived as 3 more Japanese fighters converged on Garrison's position, forcing him into a defensive spiral that took him out of the immediate fight. Perdomo selected his first target, a Frank attacking from the left quarter with perfect deflection angle. The Nakajima fighter was painted in the standard Imperial Army olive drab with red Hinomaru markings clearly visible on the fuselage. He could see the pilot's leather flying helmet through the aircraft's greenhouse canopy as the Japanese fighter lined up for a head-on pass. Perdomo held his fire until the range closed to 300 yards, then triggered a 2-second burst from all 8 machine guns. The combined weight of fire, nearly 40 pounds of metal per second, struck the Frank's engine, cowling, and cockpit area with devastating effect. The enemy fighter rolled inverted and plummeted toward the sea, trailing smoke and debris. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as more Japanese fighters entered the engagement zone. Perdomo found himself separated from his wingman as Lieutenant Mallory broke left to avoid a coordinated attack by 4 Franks approaching from the starboard side. The P-47N's superior diving speed allowed Perdomo to maintain energy advantage over his opponents, but the sheer number of enemy aircraft made sustained offensive action nearly impossible. Every time he lined up a shot, 2 or 3 more Japanese fighters would appear in his peripheral vision, forcing him into evasive maneuvers that prevented accurate gunnery. The Japanese pilots demonstrated remarkable coordination and tactical awareness. Rather than engaging in individual dogfights, they maintained formation discipline and used numerical advantage to overwhelm isolated American fighters. Perdomo watched in horror as Lieutenant Mallory's P-47 took multiple hits from a coordinated attack by 3 Franks. Smoke began streaming from the Thunderbolt's engine as Mallory transmitted his last radio call. "Lead, I'm hit bad. Engine seizing up, going down." The sturdy fighter maintained level flight for another 30 seconds before entering a terminal dive toward the Korean peninsula below. The loss of his wingman sent rage coursing through Perdomo's veins, but his training took over. Emotional responses got pilots killed. He pulled his P-47 into a climbing turn that used the aircraft's superior power-to-weight ratio to gain altitude advantage over the nearest group of Japanese fighters. The Thunderbolt's massive R-2800 engine, producing 2,800 horsepower at war emergency power settings, pulled the heavy fighter through maneuvers that would have stalled lighter aircraft. At 28,000 feet, Perdomo rolled inverted and dove toward a formation of 4 Franks that had become separated from the main group. His second kill came during a high-speed diving attack that showcased the P-47N's overwhelming firepower advantage. The target Frank attempted to evade by pulling into a tight climbing turn, but the Japanese pilot had misjudged the Thunderbolt's diving acceleration. Perdomo's 8 machine guns converged on the enemy fighter's wing route, the armor-piercing incendiary rounds igniting fuel vapors and hydraulic lines. The Frank's port wing folded upward at an impossible angle before the entire aircraft disintegrated in a shower of burning aluminum and steel. The engagement had now scattered across 20 miles of Korean airspace, with individual American fighters battling multiple Japanese opponents in a series of interconnected dogfights. Perdomo's tactical awareness allowed him to track the overall situation even while engaged in close combat. The bomber formation had maintained course and altitude, protected by the sacrifice of their fighter escorts. Several more P-47s showed battle damage, trailing smoke or flying with visible holes punched through wings and fuselages by Japanese cannon fire. The enemy fighters continued to press their attacks with suicidal determination, their pilots apparently willing to accept massive losses to stop the American bombing mission. Perdomo's third kill came as he intercepted a Frank attempting to climb toward the B-29 formation. The Japanese pilot had committed to a stern attack on the bombers, apparently believing he could slip past the remaining American fighters. Perdomo caught the enemy aircraft in a climbing turn, his superior altitude allowing him to dive down and behind the Frank with devastating effect. A 3-second burst from all 8 machine guns shredded the Japanese fighter's tail assembly and engine compartment. The Frank entered an unrecoverable spin and disappeared into the clouds below, trailing fire and debris. The ferocity of the engagement was unlike anything Perdomo had experienced during his combat tour. The Japanese pilots fought with desperate skill, their tactics revealing months of preparation and training. Yet the P-47N's superior firepower, armor protection, and diving performance were beginning to tell. Several more enemy fighters had been shot down by other members of the squadron, and the coordinated Japanese attack was fragmenting into individual dogfights that favored the more heavily armed American fighters. The aerial battlefield had devolved into a chaotic melee spanning 30 square miles of Korean airspace, with individual combat spreading from 15,000 feet to nearly 30,000 as pilots sought altitude advantage or escaped damage through desperate dives. Perdomo found himself alone, separated from the surviving members of his squadron by the violence of combat and the tactical necessity of engaging targets of opportunity. His fuel gauges showed sufficient reserves for another 20 minutes of combat operations, but ammunition counters revealed he had expended nearly half his 50 caliber rounds during the initial engagements. Every burst would need to count from this point forward. A new threat materialized from the northeast, 6 Japanese fighters in tight formation, climbing aggressively toward his position. These were fresh aircraft, their engines producing clean contrails and their formation discipline intact. Perdomo recognized the lead aircraft as another Nakajima Ki-84, but the wingmen appeared to be different types, possibly Ki-43 Oscars, or even obsolete training aircraft pressed into combat service. The desperate nature of Japan's aerial resistance was becoming clear. They were committing everything that could fly, regardless of tactical suitability or pilot experience levels. The engagement developed with lightning speed as both formations maneuvered for advantage. The Japanese pilots attempted to use their superior numbers to execute a classic bracket attack, with elements approaching from multiple angles to prevent Perdomo from focusing on any single threat. Their tactical coordination was impressive, despite the mixed aircraft types and varying performance capabilities. Perdomo countered by using the P-47N's superior diving speed to extend below their formation, then pulling up in a climbing attack that brought him into firing position on the trailing aircraft. His fourth victory came against what appeared to be a Yokosuka K-5Y trainer, a slow fabric-covered biplane that had no business in aerial combat against modern fighters. The aircraft was painted in standard Imperial Navy yellow trainer colors with red Hinomaru markings, and through his gun sight, Perdomo could see the instructor pilot in the rear cockpit desperately trying to coordinate defensive maneuvers. The sight should have been almost comical, a primary trainer aircraft attempting to engage a frontline fighter, but the courage required to take such an obsolete machine into combat against overwhelming odds commanded respect. Perdomo's burst lasted barely 1 second, but the concentrated firepower of 850 caliber machine guns proved devastatingly effective against the lightly constructed trainer. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the fabric-covered fuselage and wooden framework with explosive effect. The K-5Y's fuel tank, located directly behind the engine, erupted in flames that immediately engulfed the entire aircraft. Neither crew member had time to bail out before the trainer entered a flat spin and disappeared into the cloud layer below. The psychological impact of destroying the trainer aircraft affected the remaining Japanese fighters in ways Perdomo had not anticipated. Rather than breaking off the attack, the enemy pilots pressed forward with increased determination, their formation discipline abandoned in favor of individual kamikaze-style attacks. 2 Ki-43 Oscars dove toward his position with guns blazing, their lighter armament of 2 12.7mm machine guns chattering rapidly as they attempted to bracket his flight path. The tactical situation had shifted from coordinated combat to desperate individual dueling. Perdomo's combat experience and the P-47N's superior performance characteristics began to tell decisively. The Thunderbolt's ability to absorb damage while maintaining flight performance had been proven throughout the Pacific campaign, and now that legendary durability faced its ultimate test. Multiple 20mm cannon shells from the attacking Franks had struck his aircraft, leaving visible holes in the wing surfaces and tail assembly, but the massive radial engine continued producing full power and the flight controls remained responsive. The fifth and final victory of Perdomo's legendary mission developed during a head-on pass with a Frank that had become separated from its wingmen during the confused fighting. The Japanese pilot demonstrated exceptional skill and courage, maintaining formation discipline and accurate gunnery even as his aircraft absorbed punishment that would have downed lighter fighters. Both pilots opened fire simultaneously at 800 yards range, their combined armament creating intersecting streams of tracer ammunition that painted deadly patterns across the Korean sky. The P-47N's overwhelming firepower advantage proved decisive. While the Frank's two 20mm cannon and twin machine guns represented formidable armament, they could not match the sheer volume of fire produced by 850 caliber Brownings, operating in perfect synchronization. Perdomo's burst lasted 3 seconds and delivered nearly 200 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition into the enemy fighter's engine compartment and cockpit area. The Frank's radial engine seized immediately, windmilling to a stop as hydraulic fluid and engine oil streamed back over the aircraft's canopy. The Japanese pilot attempted to maintain control as his fighter entered a shallow dive, but the combination of engine failure and battle damage rendered the aircraft unrecoverable. Perdomo watched as the enemy pilot struggled with his canopy release mechanism, apparently attempting to bail out before impact. The Frank rolled inverted and entered a terminal spin at 12,000 feet, disappearing into the mountainous terrain of Central Korea with no sign of a parachute deployment. The tactical situation across the broader engagement area was reaching conclusion as surviving Japanese fighters began withdrawing toward their bases. Fuel limitations and battle damage were forcing individual aircraft to break off combat, their coordinated attack having failed to reach the B-29 bomber formation that continued on course toward its assigned targets. The cost had been enormous on both sides. At least 15 Japanese fighters destroyed against 4 American P-47s lost, a ratio that reflected superior training, equipment, and tactical doctrine, but could not diminish the courage displayed by pilots on both sides. Perdomo found himself alone in the sky as the last enemy fighters disappeared toward the west, their contrails fading into the morning haze above the Korean peninsula. His aircraft showed extensive battle damage, multiple cannon holes in the wings and fuselage, damaged radio equipment, and hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines in the landing gear compartment. Yet the massive R-2800 engine continued running smoothly, and the flight controls responded normally to his inputs. The P-47N's reputation for bringing pilots home despite severe damage was proving itself once again. The gun camera film would later confirm what Perdomo already knew: 5 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission, making him an ace in one day and the final American pilot to achieve that distinction during World War II. The significance would not become clear until intelligence officers reviewed the combat footage and confirmed each victory against Japanese records captured after the war's end. For now, he faced the immediate challenge of nursing his damaged fighter back to Aishima while processing the emotional toll of losing Lieutenant Mallory and witnessing the desperate courage of enemy pilots who had fought to their deaths despite overwhelming odds. The return flight would provide time for reflection on the morning's events, but first came the practical matter of survival. Fuel gauges showed adequate reserves for the return journey, and the engine continued producing full power despite visible battle damage to the cowling and accessory equipment. The P-47N had proven its legendary durability once again, bringing another pilot home from the most violent aerial combat of his career. The coral runway at Aishima emerged from the Pacific haze like salvation itself as Perdomo guided his battle-damaged P-47N through the landing pattern. Hydraulic fluid continued streaming from severed lines in the landing gear compartment, creating an oily trail across the aircraft's belly that caught the afternoon sunlight. The massive Pratt & Whitney engine had run flawlessly throughout the return flight despite visible cannon damage to the cowling and accessory sections, testament to the rugged engineering that had made the Thunderbolt legendary among Pacific theater pilots. Ground crews spotted the battle damage immediately as Lil Meaty's meat chopper rolled to a stop on the hard stand. 20mm cannon holes punctured both wings and the fuselage, while machine gun bullets had stitched a pattern across the vertical stabilizer that missed critical control cables by inches. Chief Master Sergeant Tony Kowalski, Perdomo's regular crew chief, ran his hands across the damaged aluminum skin with the practiced eye of a mechanic who had seen hundreds of combat-damaged aircraft return from missions over Japanese-held territory. "Jesus, Lieutenant, what the hell did you run into up there?" Kowalski's Brooklyn accent carried a mixture of amazement and concern as he examined the extent of battle damage. "I count at least 30 holes in the wings alone, and that hydraulic line looks like someone took a hacksaw to it. How the hell did you keep her flying?" The question would be repeated dozens of times over the following hours as word spread throughout the 507th Fighter Group about the morning's engagement and its unprecedented scale. Squadron Operations Officer Major William Henderson was waiting as Perdomo climbed down from the cockpit, his clipboard already filled with preliminary after-action report forms that would document every aspect of the mission for intelligence analysis. The loss of Lieutenant Mallory weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable commodities in the Pacific Theater, and losing anyone with Mallory's combat record represented a significant tactical setback for the squadron's overall effectiveness. "Walk me through it from the beginning," Henderson said as they moved toward the squadron operations building. "Intelligence is having a hard time believing the contact reports. 50-plus enemy fighters in coordinated formation. That's the largest Japanese air response we've seen in months. Where the hell did they find the fuel for that kind of operation?" The questions reflected broader strategic concerns about Japan's remaining military capabilities as the war entered what many believed would be its final weeks. The debriefing session lasted 3 hours as Perdomo provided detailed accounts of aircraft types, pilot tactics, and engagement sequences that would inform future combat operations. His gun camera film would prove crucial in confirming individual victory claims. But more importantly, it would provide intelligence analysts with unprecedented footage of Japanese fighter tactics and aircraft performance during the war's final phase. The coordinated nature of the enemy attack suggested levels of training and fuel availability that contradicted most intelligence estimates. Colonel James Mitchell, commanding officer of the 507th Fighter Group, arrived during the technical portion of the debriefing to personally review the combat footage. The grainy black and white film showed each engagement with stark clarity: the head-on pass that destroyed the first Nakajima Frank, the diving attack on the Yokosuka trainer, and the final victory against a fighter that had demonstrated remarkable pilot skill despite overwhelming firepower disadvantage. 5 confirmed kills in a single mission, Mitchell said quietly. That makes you an ace in one day, Lieutenant. More importantly, it makes you the last American pilot to achieve ace status during this war. The significance of that achievement would not become fully apparent until years later, when military historians documented the final aerial victories of World War II. Perdomo's mission on August 13, 1945, represented the culmination of American fighter development and pilot training programs that had evolved throughout the Pacific Campaign. The P-47N Thunderbolt embodied lessons learned from thousands of combat missions, superior firepower, rugged construction, and long-range capability that allowed sustained operations deep into enemy territory. News of the engagement spread rapidly throughout the base as off-duty personnel gathered around the operations building to examine the battle-damaged Thunderbolt and hear first-hand accounts from surviving pilots. The emotional toll of losing Lieutenant Mallory affected everyone who had known him, but there was also pride in Perdomo's achievement and the tactical success of preventing Japanese fighters from reaching the B-29 bomber formation. The bombers had completed their mission without interference, delivering their ordnance loads with precision that further degraded Japan's remaining military infrastructure. The formal award ceremony took place 3 days later as Colonel Mitchell presented Perdomo with the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest decorations for valor that could be awarded by the United States Army Air Forces. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy while serving as a pilot with the 464th Fighter Squadron, 507th Fighter Group, Far East Air Forces, in aerial combat against enemy Japanese forces on 13 August 1945. Lieutenant Perdomo's exceptional flying skill, aggressive fighting spirit, and devotion to duty resulted in the destruction of 5 enemy aircraft during a single mission. The ceremony was attended by surviving members of the squadron, ground crews who had maintained the P-47N through months of combat operations, and base personnel who understood the significance of Perdomo's achievement within the broader context of the Pacific War. Photographers documented the event for military publications and hometown newspapers, creating a permanent record of the final American ace of World War II, receiving recognition for his combat performance. Private moments of reflection came later as Perdomo sat alone in his quarters, processing the emotional complexity of surviving such an intense combat engagement while losing his wingman and friend. The 5 Japanese pilots he had shot down were human beings with families, training, and combat experience comparable to his own. Their courage in pressing coordinated attacks against overwhelming odds deserved respect, even from the enemy pilot who had killed them. War created such paradoxes, moments of professional admiration for opponents whose destruction was necessary for mission success and personal survival. The broader strategic implications of the engagement became clear over the following days as intelligence analysts processed gun camera footage and interrogated captured Japanese personnel. The coordinated fighter attack represented one of Japan's final attempts to inflict significant casualties on American bombing formations, using carefully hoarded fuel reserves and experienced pilots held in reserve for exactly such missions. The tactical failure of that attack essentially ended organized Japanese fighter resistance in the Korean Peninsula area. Lil Meaty's meat chopper required 2 weeks of repair work to restore flight status, with replacement aluminum panels covering the cannon holes and new hydraulic lines installed throughout the landing gear system. Chief Master Sergeant Kowalski supervised every aspect of the restoration with personal attention that reflected his professional pride and emotional attachment to an aircraft that had brought his pilot home from the most dangerous mission of the war. The P-47N would fly additional combat sorties before the war's end, but none would match the intensity and significance of August 13, 1945. The final entries in Perdomo's flight log recorded routine patrol missions and escort duties as Japan's remaining military forces prepared for the inevitable surrender that would end World War II. His achievement as the last American ace represented both personal triumph and historical culmination, the final expression of fighter pilot skill and courage that had characterized American air power throughout the Pacific Campaign. The news of Japan's surrender reached Ie Shima on August 15, 1945, transmitted through official military channels and confirmed by multiple radio broadcasts that crackled across the Pacific airwaves. Perdomo stood beside his repaired P-47N Thunderbolt as base personnel erupted in celebration, their cheers echoing across the coral runways where so many combat missions had begun during the brutal final year of the Pacific War. The timing was surreal. His achievement as the last American ace had occurred just 2 days before hostilities officially ended, making his aerial victories a final punctuation mark on 4 years of devastating air combat. The immediate aftermath of surrender brought unexpected challenges as military planners scrambled to transition from wartime operations to occupation duties. The massive logistical apparatus that had supported sustained bombing campaigns against Japanese targets now required redirection toward humanitarian missions and the complex process of demobilizing millions of military personnel scattered across the Pacific theater. For fighter pilots like Perdomo, the sudden end of combat operations created an emotional vacuum that would take months to process fully. Letters from home arrived in greater frequency as postal services resumed normal schedules without the constant threat of enemy interdiction. Perdomo's family in New Mexico had followed his combat tour through carefully censored correspondence, but now they could learn the full details of his final mission and its historical significance. His mother's letters expressed relief that the war had ended before claiming her son, while his father, a veteran of the Great War, understood the complex emotions that accompanied survival when so many comrades had not been as fortunate. The process of documenting wartime achievements took on new urgency as military historians began compiling official records that would preserve individual stories within the broader narrative of Allied victory. Perdomo's gun camera film from August 13th became part of an extensive archive that documented American air power evolution from the desperate early days of 1942 through the overwhelming technological superiority demonstrated during the war's final year. His 5 confirmed victories represented not just personal achievement, but the culmination of training programs, aircraft development, and tactical doctrine that had transformed the United States Army Air Forces into the world's most effective military aviation organization. Chief Master Sergeant Kowalski supervised the preparation of Lil Meaty's meat chopper for its final combat configuration documentation, ensuring that every battle scar and repair, was photographed for historical records. The aircraft's service history included 73 combat missions spanning 8 months of Pacific theater operations, with Perdomo as its primary pilot for the final 40 missions. The P-47N had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter fighters while maintaining the reliability and firepower that brought its pilot home from the most dangerous aerial engagement of his career. The transition from combat operations to occupation duties proved psychologically difficult for many experienced pilots who had spent years focused on the singular goal of defeating Japanese military forces. Perdomo found himself assigned to routine patrol flights over former enemy territory, monitoring compliance with surrender terms and providing aerial reconnaissance for ground forces establishing control over strategic locations. The missions lacked the intensity and purpose that had defined combat operations, creating a sense of anticlimax that affected many veterans during the immediate post-war period. Visits from war correspondents and military photographers became frequent as public relations officers recognized the propaganda value of Perdomo's achievement. The story of the last American ace resonated with audiences eager for heroic narratives that could provide meaning to the massive sacrifices of the previous 4 years. Magazine articles and newspaper features portrayed his final mission as emblematic of American fighting spirit and technological superiority, though Perdomo himself remained uncomfortable with the attention and preferred to emphasize the contributions of wingmen and ground crews who had made individual achievements possible. The emotional complexity of victory became apparent during quiet moments when the immediate excitement of surrender had faded and the reality of survival set in. Lieutenant Mallory's death continued to weigh on Perdomo's conscience, despite rational understanding that combat losses were inevitable consequences of aerial warfare. The 5 Japanese pilots he had killed during his final mission had demonstrated courage and skill that commanded professional respect, even from the enemy who had destroyed them. War created such moral paradoxes that would require years of reflection to fully comprehend. Military planners began discussing the future of American air power in a world where atomic weapons had fundamentally altered strategic calculations. The B-29 superfortresses that Perdomo had escorted to their targets over Korea would soon carry nuclear ordnance that could destroy entire cities with single aircraft, making traditional fighter escorts potentially obsolete in future conflicts. The technological revolution represented by atomic weapons suggested that the kind of individual heroism demonstrated during conventional aerial combat might become irrelevant in wars fought with weapons of unprecedented destructive power. Preparations for demobilization and return to civilian life created mixed emotions among career military personnel who had dedicated years to perfecting combat skills that would no longer be needed. Perdomo faced decisions about his post-war future, whether to remain in military service during the peacetime reorganization or return to civilian employment in an economy that would need to absorb millions of returning veterans. The skills that had made him an exceptional fighter pilot translated imperfectly to civilian occupations, creating challenges that would affect many combat veterans during the transition period. The formal inactivation ceremony for the 464th Fighter Squadron took place in November 1945 as the unit's P-47N Thunderbolts were prepared for transfer to stateside storage facilities or Allied air forces that would continue operating American aircraft during the occupation period. Perdomo's final flight in Lil Meaty's meat chopper was a symbolic farewell to both his aircraft and the combat role that had defined his military service. The P-47N would be preserved in storage until eventually transferred to a museum where future generations could examine the technology and craftsmanship that had helped win the Pacific War. The broader historical significance of Perdomo's achievement became clearer as military analysts documented the final phase of aerial combat in the Pacific theater. His 5 victories on August 13th represented the culmination of American fighter development programs that had evolved from the inadequate aircraft available during the Pearl Harbor attack to the technological superiority demonstrated by the P-47N Thunderbolt and other advanced fighters available during the war's final year. The progression reflected not just industrial capability, but the accumulated experience of thousands of pilots whose individual sacrifices had contributed to overall tactical doctrine. Decades later, military historians would recognize Perdomo's mission as representing the end of an era in aerial warfare. The individual combat skills and aircraft performance characteristics that had defined fighter operations throughout World War II would soon be superseded by jet engines, guided missiles, and electronic systems that placed greater emphasis on technology than on pilot ability. His achievement as the last American ace marked the final expression of combat flying, as it had existed since the Wright brothers first demonstrated powered flight, making him not just a wartime hero, but a historical figure who embodied the transition between eras of military aviation. The quiet dignity with which Perdomo processed his wartime experiences would characterize his approach to post-war life, as he gradually adjusted to civilian routines while carrying memories of aerial combat that few Americans would ever fully understand.